Hi everyone, Dr. Snexer here again, and today we are continuing our discussion on sex differences in behavior, specifically looking again at sexual selection. So we talked last week about Bateman's principle and Trivers' ideas about parental investment and how the sexes, based on a lot of different aspects of their biology, physiology, their formation of gametes, and ultimately the investment that they're putting into their offspring, we would expect to see differences in their behavior as related to sexual reproduction and then as related to other aspects of behavior too. And so that leads us to our discussion on sexual selection and how we see two different types of sexual selection. Intra-sexual selection, which we spoke about last week, which tells us a little bit about individuals of one sex competing with each other for mates. So essentially, due to the differential amount of investment that males and females are putting into their offspring, we tend to see variance in males when it comes to who is able to access the females. Essentially, females are a limited resource for them since females are investing so much and they have more limited mating opportunities than males do. We expect that males will need to compete with one another in order to access that limited resource of the female and her eggs. And so we tend to see competition between males, and we talked about how that actually looks in a variety of different species. Of course, there are exceptions to that. In some species, females are actually going to invest less in offspring than males do, and we tend to see competition amongst females for mates. So this isn't the only type of interaction that we see with sexual selection, male-male interactions, but it is the most common. Today, we're going to focus on intersexual selection, where one sex is more choosy than the others and is choosy in who they will mate with. I do have a picture of a male here. This is not a female. But what we tend to see, as we'll talk about today, that this often leads to some interesting characteristics and sex differences between the sexes, sex differences between the sexes, of course, that is because of this female choice that exists. So that's basically what we're going to run through quickly today, or sort of focusing on females. Again, it's possible that depending on the species, males could be the choosier sex if females are investing less than males are. But typically what we see are females being choosier since they are limited in their mating opportunities, and therefore they should really be judging the males that they are allowing to fertilize their eggs. And so we have a variety of different examples here in which we see female mate choice sort of being exhibited in different ways. So we'll go through all these different mate choice models, which are not the only ones, but perhaps the most well-studied. We'll understand how direct benefits can be used when understanding who females are choosing. We'll look at some good genes ideas, that selection is for choosing fathers that have the best genes. And then we'll quickly go through runaway selection and sensory exploitation that helps us to understand how this female choice evolves. So this is probably the most obvious point that I will make today. Because females are choosing their mates, they will want to choose those mates based on some sort of aspect of them. And specifically, it would make sense if they chose a mate who was providing them with some sort of direct benefit. So increasing the survival and reproduction of the offspring or of the female herself, so that the female could then increase the survival and reproduction of their offspring. That's what we're referring to when we are talking about the female mate choice model that includes direct benefits. Females should choose mates that are going to provide them with some sort of important resource. This could be food, this could be shelter, this could be vigilance, protection, this could be assistance with parental care, etc., etc. The most obvious, and one you've probably heard of before, is this interesting phenomenon that we see in many species of insects and arachnids, which are the presentation of nuptial gifts. Yes, nuptial gifts. So nuptials are referring to like weddings or marriage. We talk about nuptials as sort of like the commitment that males and females make to each other. And nuptial gifts are the term that we use to describe the gifts that are given to a mate. And here we see an example of balloon flies, which is one group of insects in which the males present the females with some sort of food. So usually nuptial gifts are food. And here we have a fly. It says, "Please love me, I bring you a fly." Right? We have a fly that the male is presenting to the female. Now, why does he do this? Why does the male take the time to find a prey item, wrap it all up beautifully, and present it to this female? Well, I know you're thinking, obviously this is food for the female. Yes, correct. This is food for the female. But is a balloon fly sitting there thinking, wow, I'm not going to mate with this guy unless he brings me some food? I mean, maybe she is, right? Maybe it's also just our human bias that thinks that way. Maybe because we know human females before they're reproducing with males, appreciate a bit of courtship, maybe dinner and movie, or a few years of courtship, a long engagement, a wonderful wedding, and then maybe a couple of years, and then she'll finally reproduce with them. But regardless, perhaps it's our bias. Likely, the female is not thinking in that way at all. But we see these interesting patterns of behavior here. So if we look at these graphs where we're understanding the presentation of this nuptial prey item, we see that larger nuptial gifts result in longer copulation times. So the actual reproductive act lasts for a longer period of time. So again, just to orient you here to this graph, this is called a scatter plot, and we have these different dots that are representing essentially different pairings of males and female balloon flies. And you can see different sized nuptial prey. So, if it weighs, or whatever this is, sort of a volume metric, right? Where it has a volume of 10 millimeters squared. Okay, not a volume, it's an area. But 10 millimeters squared, 20, 30, 40, 50, as we go up along the x-axis, we see larger nuptial gifts versus smaller nuptial gifts. And then if we look up the y-axis here, we have the duration of copulation in minutes, right? From 0 to over 30 minutes. And you can see there's this clear relationship. It does sort of level out after about 20 millimeters squared in terms of the nuptial gift size. But between 0 and 20, we see a clear increase in copulation time related to the size of the nuptial gift, and then sort of a leveling out. 30 minutes seems to be the max duration for copulation time. So clearly, right, what's our take-home message from these data? These data show us very clearly that larger nuptial gifts means increased duration of copulation for these males. So it pays. It pays to give the females a gift, especially when you consider this graph over here, which is showing us a clear correlation again, but this time we're looking at the duration of copulation. So how long reproduction is lasting, again, equivalent to this graph over here, the y-axis, but we're looking at it here on our x-axis, and its relationship to the number of sperm that are transferred in the hundreds. So if we look in the first, 6 minutes of copulation, there is 0 sperm transferred. It's only after about 6 or 7 minutes that we see an increase, and we do see this high increase as duration continues in how much sperm will actually be transferred. So male balloon flies need that copulation to last for some period of time, and the longer it lasts, the more sperm will be transferred, which would of course increase the opportunity for fertilization. So we see this direct relationship in the male presenting this nuptial gift and therefore increasing the likelihood that fertilizations would happen. And so females, in turn, should be choosing males that present them with larger nuptial gifts. Males are playing a role in this female choice. Nuptial gifts are a great example of direct benefits to females, but it doesn't always have to be as obvious as the males giving the females a gift in order to receive that mating opportunity. In many species, what we see is sort of a correlation between some qualities of the male that are providing these direct benefits to the females. So for example, here, if we look at the red-winged blackbird, so here's our male red-winged blackbird, here's our female red-winged blackbird. What we have in red-winged blackbirds is territoriality for the males. So the males, they spend their time in sort of like marshy areas like this one, and they arrive on the territory and defend the territory, like we talked about last week, how some males, establish those territories every day. These males establish their territory early on in the breeding season, and their territories vary in quality. So some territories, have greater food sources, better protection than other males. And females will actually choose their male mates based on the quality of their territory, which is usually correlated with some other qualities of the males. But she benefits directly because she'll be able to find food more easily if she's on a good quality territory that has more food. And this is obviously a direct benefit to her and to her offspring. So again, sort of whatever the males are providing in terms of these direct benefits can directly influence female choice. Female choice may also be influenced more indirectly, specifically by looking at the genes of the males. So not the females. The females are not looking at the genes of the males, but the females may be making the choices about their mates in an indirect way that is correlated with the genes that these males have. And of course, the genes that the males have are important because those genes are going to be passed on to the offspring of these females. We're talking about sexually reproducing species here in which the offspring are 50% related to the female and 50% related to the male. And so females would benefit if their selection was based on the genes that the males have that then would be passed on to their sons and daughters. Zahavi was the scientist who first proposed this idea of a handicapped principle, which has since gone through many iterations, and many wonderful scientists have contributed to understanding this idea more. But the basic hypothesis is that often we will see that males have some handicap that essentially would decrease their overall survival, but females will prefer that trait. So, for example, we have the classic example of sexual selection here. We always have to talk about peafowl when we are talking about sexual selection. So here we have our peacock, which is the male, which of course I'm sure you're all familiar with his bright, long, beautiful tail. These feathers are energetically costly to make. They're heavy to carry, and they're also a clear indicator to predators that, the peacocks are around. These birds are not hiding very well in the brush. They're basically calling to tigers to come eat them. And so those traits, right, would not be considered to be very beneficial in terms of natural selection, right? Darwin looked at the peacock and thought, what the heck is this? How can I explain the peacock's feathers with my theory of natural selection? I cannot. This is sort of the birth of the idea of sexual selection, that males might actually have these traits as an indicator to females that they are good quality because they survive despite these traits. So despite having these very costly traits, they have survived to reproduction, and therefore they have good genes. And so peafowl females, which are here the peahens, peafowl hens, the peahens, should prefer males that have brighter and more elaborate traits, because this is an indicator of good genes, that they're able to survive. And these genes would then be passed on to her sons and daughters who would benefit from those good quality genes. And so the peacock is the classic example of this, but there are many examples in other animals that some of these more costly traits are looked at by females and preferred by females because they do actually indicate to us, to the females, some survival advantage. Directly related to this idea, we could also look at this in terms of just general male health. Females should ultimately prefer males that have good genes in terms of their parasite load or in terms of their immune system and how good it is at fighting disease. And what's really interesting is that we have found that some physical characteristics of males that are correlated to disease and parasite infection are actually the traits that females prefer. So again, let's look at an example of this to better understand this. Here we have some fish. They're my favorite. We have some sticklebacks. Here you can see, our classic male and female stickleback fish. Males have this bright red coloration that's on their belly, like super intense bright red, and usually sort of some blues and yellows in them. And females, as we often see in species where we have this intense intersexual selection, the females are much drabber, just like the peahens that we looked at in the previous example. They don't have that super pretty coloration, right? Just like last week we looked at the pupfish. We had the same sort of pattern where the males were brightly colored and the females were much better adapted to blending in with their environment. So why is this? Lots of reasons, but one that we have found is that bright coloration is actually correlated with parasite infection. So again, if we go to the graphs here we're looking at the correlation on this scatter plot for males. So all these dots represent different males. And we can look at the intensity of their color. So how bright they are, right? 0 to, that's pretty dull red, where up to 10 would be very, very bright. And we can look at how that relates to their condition. So this condition factor over here is sort of a bunch of different aspects of their health, which would indicate to us, what their parasite load is, or other health indicators, right? So the healthier the males are, the higher this condition factor would be. And again, we see this positive correlation between color and condition factor. So the brighter you are, the healthier you are. You're in better health. The duller you are, you're not in as good of health. So there's this clear correlation. Okay, makes sense, right? This coloration is actually linked to the genetics, the physiology of these males. What we need to see to understand how this relates to intersexual selection is what the females prefer. And that's what this graph is showing us. Here we have color intensity again, looking at bright versus dull males. And we have female choice for the brightness of the male. So how much time that female is spending, right, engaged in courtship with these males, because the sticklebacks do a very interesting courtship display around their nest. So how much time is the female, involved in that in terms of seconds? And again, we see a correlation. We see that the brighter males, now these males were all generally dull, so they kind of had lower color intensity scores. But of those, the ones that were brighter, females spent more time near. The ones that were duller, females did not spend as much time near those males. Interesting, right? So we're seeing this direct relationship between the female choice and the condition factor, right? What condition they're in. But how do females know what condition they're in? It has to do with the color intensity. So the indicator that the male is providing to that female. What's even more interesting, right? You're like, well, what if you take the red away? What if you take the red away? You can do that when red color is filtered out. Basically, you can use special lights, or you can just put the fish all in red light so everybody's equally red. When that happens, the female preference sort of goes away. The female, that intense red color is no longer apparent, or they're all equally red, essentially. Then the female does not make any sort of, or spend any extra time with the males who originally had the brighter color and originally had the better condition. So this is showing us sort of one example how female choice, although not overtly related to good genes, indirectly it is. Females are using certain characteristics of the males to choose their mates that are going to offer their offspring the best genetic makeup that they can, since the females are limited in their reproduction in the first place. There's also a whole lot of crazy things that happen because of this. So when we consider this female choice for males, we sometimes find that it sort of can get out of control. And this is a phenomenon that we call runaway selection. So females are selecting males for a certain trait, but it may get to the point that that selection is no longer beneficial for the males. So for example, here we have sort of a hypothetical situation. Just ignore this guy up here for a second. Look at these birds. You could imagine that these are the ancestors of peacocks, right? So if we're looking at peafowl, Imagine that these birds perhaps are the ancestor of the peacocks. We know at some point, having a certain length tail is a survival advantage. And what I mean by that is, having a tail helps in flight to a point, right? Having a medium-sized tail is beneficial. There's an advantage to it, or at least there's not a disadvantage to it. But having those tail feathers is beneficial to these males. So there's an advantage for these males. It's not going to hinder them in any way. At some point, what we see is that females prefer males that have a long tail feather, right? At some point. And this is key to preference. This is key to preference of females. We know that there is genetic control, that females prefer long tails or the red coloration of sticklebacks or the males who have a good quality territory, because there's some preference innately within the females. And what we propose with runaway selection is that this trait, this preference that the females have for the trait, there's sort of this overlap where at some point the females prefer long tails, long-ish tails, and the males, are not hindered by having those long tails. There's still an advantage for them. But with each generation, because the females show this preference for longer tails, and because not all males are going to reproduce, right? This is sort of the key point about intersexual selection. Females are being choosy and choosing their best mates. But we know from our understanding of intrasexual selection, there's extreme variation in which males actually reproduce, which males are actually going to be the ones that pass on their genes successfully. And so females are selecting for that portion of the population. So you can imagine, imagine our bell-shaped curve that we always look at, and imagine that at the far end of that bell-shaped curve, the males with the longest tails are the ones that are reproducing. And in the next generation, the birds will all have longer tails, but there's still going to be a small subset of males who have the longest tails, and the females will prefer them. And in the next generation, the females will prefer, again, that subset of males that has the longest tails. So with each generation, the tails will get longer and longer to a point. There's going to come a point when the tail length is no longer an advantage for the males. It's actually going to start to hinder them. Having that long tail uses a lot of energy, like we talked about with peacocks. It could lead to difficulty in flying because those tails get very heavy. It could lead to increased predation since those tails are very noticeable, and of course the males are not able to fly as well. So there could come this point where it's actually a disadvantage to males to have longer tails, but the female preference is so strong for those longer tails that the females will continue to choose the males with the longest tails in each generation. It is possible that as they choose males with the longer tails, that in that next generation, the males who have the longest tails aren't able to survive. And so it doesn't completely evolve out of control, but there is this runaway, right? Hence the name, runaway selection, where with each generation, that trait that the females prefer becomes more and more and more and more intense in some way. So the peacocks, we think, are a product of runaway selection. This sort of explains that elaborate tail. Yes, I told you it's related. to, the females choosing their good genes, since if you choose males who have long tails, they'll have babies who have long tails, and those males will be the ones who continue to reproduce. So it is related to the idea of the handicap principle. However, we also think that it is a product of runaway selection. And so this is likely what led to those elaborate traits in the first place. Here's our other example. This is the stock-eyed fly. So these are look at this. These are flies. These are eyes at the end of these long stalks. I mean, ridiculous, to the point that vision within these flies is very difficult, to say the least, as opposed to flies that have, eyes more centrally located on their bodies. We know that this is a product of runaway selection, that females preferred males that had eye stalks that were a little widespread. And in certain species of the stock-eyed flies, these became more and more and more elaborate, longer and longer and longer, due to female choice for the males that had the longest eye stalks. And so we know that this is a product of this runaway selection. Not really a survival advantage for the males, but it is a reproductive advantage, which ultimately is more important than surviving. If you survive but don't reproduce, your alleles do not get passed on to that next generation. And so we know that sexual selection is a very important driving force of evolution. Related to runaway selection, in terms of being an explanation for why certain traits are preferred by these females, is this idea of sensory bias. So perhaps it's not just that a random female preference comes up within a random mutation. Like in that last example, I talked about how there is a female preference for males who have a long tail. And I sort of spoke of that in a way that the females just randomly prefer the males who have the longer feathers. That does happen. It does happen that on occasion that female preference really is not related to the trait per se. It's just a random preference that occurs. But often we think that it's not random. Often we think that there's some sort of innate bias that already exists, that females already like something, they are attracted to it, they have a preference for something that then sort of spills over into their reproductive choices. And the most obvious example of that is when we're talking about a preference for red coloration, which is something that we see in a diverse group of animals. So I talked about sticklebacks, females having a preference for red. Reds and oranges are preferred in many other species of fishes, in many species of birds, and also in many species of primates. Here we have a wakari, which is a monkey who has this obvious red face, this bright red coloration, and also this reddish fur color. But this bright red face is something that's very obvious. And we know that female wakari prefer to mate with males who have brighter red faces. We do think, much like our discussion about the sticklebacks, that the red maybe is some indicator of health. But regardless of that, why is it that the females prefer this red coloration in these male wakari? Well, we think that it actually is an exploitation of the female's preference for red fruit. So female wakari and many other female primate species do have a preference for red fruits. Red fruits are often full of important nutrients and delicious, let's be honest. And so they're attracted to that red coloration. And we think that the mating preference is almost a spillover of that preference for red in the first place. And so when there is a correlation between red coloration and male health, we aren't too surprised when the female preference for that red coloration exists. And there's been some work on this, not just understanding the female preference, but also understanding more about the evolution of this preference. And so here's a phylogenetic analysis of many different species of primates. So we have our different primate species listed here, and I assume you've seen phylogenetic analyses like these before. Essentially, the branches are just showing us the proposed relatedness of all these. So these are essentially the same trees, right? If we're looking at the two of them together, they have the same species plotted out for us here with the same branching patterns. But what's interesting about these phylogenies is these little sort of pie charts that we have here. These pie charts are showing us two different things. In figure A, we are looking at the ability of the specific primates to see the color red. Okay, so not all primates are able to see the color red. We are. We're in Hominidae down here, the hominids. We do have the ability to see red, but this group up here, right, our lemurs, Loridae, they Indires, they cannot see the color red. Okay, so that is what these white pie charts are showing for us. They are unable to see the color red. We think that in evolutionary time, this common ancestor of all of these primate groups were able to see the color red. So this primate ancestor was able to see all red, and it's not surprising that all the branches off of that ancestor also are able to see red. Here in figure B, the pie charts are representing the abundance of food and the preference for the food that is red. So here's a phylogenetic analysis suggesting red coloration is present here. So the preference for the color red and the appearance of the red face, the red fur, occurs here on this branch. So each of these little pie charts is showing us essentially how red the skin is of these different primates, and the Wakaria are here in this group, and we see that other species within these groups also have that red coloration. So we saw much earlier in the phylogenetic analysis that the ability to see red and likely the preference for red evolved already, right? Before the red facial or other skin coloration that is preferred in these species. And so we think about this as sensory bias. The sensory systems of these primates was already biased towards the color red, and then link that with male condition, and we start to see an obvious preference of females for that bright red coloration. So related to the idea of runaway selection, in that we're trying to understand, how and why females are making their choices. And we think that it may have to do with other predisposed preferences that the females have. So today we just quickly went over some of those female mate choice models that help us to understand a little bit more about how females are choosing their mates. Again, going back to the idea of Bateman's principle of parental investment and the differential reproductive success of the sexes. Females are more limited in their reproductive opportunities because they are investing more in offspring, in their gametes, in the whole reproductive effort. And so they generally are able, as individuals, to have fewer offspring than individual males. Individual males have the opportunity to have more offspring. They have the opportunity to fertilize many, many, many more eggs than females would ever be able to produce. But think about that. Who are these males reproducing with? They're reproducing with the females. And so if females are limited, if they are the limited resource in the population, then only a small number of males are going to be able to reproduce at their maximum, or at least reproduce in higher numbers. And this is what results in that variation in male reproduction effort. Some males produce a lot. They have more mating opportunities and they produce more offspring, and some males don't reproduce at all. So there's a lot of variance in male reproductive success. And if we want to understand which males are going to be more successful, that's what helps us to understand intrasexual selection, the males who are more successful at competing with other males for access to mates, either directly or indirectly. They are going to procure more mating opportunities. Additionally, males that are chosen, males that are preferred by females because of, again, direct or indirect benefits, those males are going to be more successful. So it's an interplay here of the male's ability to compete with other males and the male having specific traits that the females are going to prefer, be it genetic traits or territories or nuptial gifts or what have you. But male reproductive opportunities are going to be dictated by intrasexual and intersexual selection, and females hypothetically should always have the opportunity to reproduce, and they will reproduce with those males who are going to provide them with the greatest benefits. So I think it's a whole bunch for you to think about today. What else should you be working on as we're getting closer and closer to the end of this semester? Well, if you haven't yet, make sure you take our final quiz. Quiz number 5 is the knowledge celebration for week 11. Can you even believe it? I know. So quiz number 5, posted up on D2L from 10 a.m. till noon. So like I said, if you haven't taken it yet, make sure you pop over and do that soon. We also have a posted reading like we do every week, so make sure you give that a look. And then as always, our live sessions will be on Wednesday or Friday this week. So if you'd like to come to the classroom on Wednesday or join me on Zoom on Friday, all are welcome to either session. And if you can't make it, that live recording will be posted Friday afternoon. And we'll be talking a little bit about exceptions to these general patterns that we were looking at. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email or contact me at any time. Hope you have a great day.